The helicopter's rotors beat against the morning air like a restless heart as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her headset and gazed down at the endless expanse of floodwater below. 3 days of relentless rain had transformed the familiar landscape of rural Texas into something unrecognizably a vast, brown mirror reflecting the gray sky above. "Never seen flooding this bad," her pilot, Jake, said through the crackling intercom. His weathered hands gripped the controls as they swept over what used to be farmland, now completely submerged beneath murky water. Sarah nodded, her notepad balanced on her lap as she documented the damage for the insurance company. Houses stood like islands in the temporary sea, their roofs barely visible above the waterline. Broken fences stretched out like skeletal fingers, and debris floated everywhere. Pieces of barns, farming equipment, entire trees uprooted from their homes. But it wasn't the widespread destruction that made her stomach tighten with an old, familiar knot of anxiety. It was the knowledge of where they were heading. "Coming up on the Whitmore property now," Jake announced, banking the aircraft slightly to the left. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Even from this height, even transformed by the flood, she recognized the land that had haunted her thoughts for 30 years. The Whitmore Ranch, the place she had never been allowed to set foot on, despite growing up just 5 miles away. Thomas Whitmore's funeral had been last week. Sarah hadn't gone, though half the town had turned out to pay their respects to the reclusive rancher who had built an empire on 15,000 acres of prime Texas land. She had watched the procession from her kitchen window instead, stirring her coffee until it grew cold, wondering why his death felt like the closing of a door she had never even tried to open. "Jesus," Jake whispered, and Sarah's attention snapped back to the present. Below them, the Whitmore Ranch was completely underwater. The main house, that sprawling, white colonial mansion she had glimpsed only from the road, sat chest-deep in floodwater. The famous red barns were nearly submerged, their peaked roofs breaking the surface like the backs of sleeping giants. But it was what the flood had revealed that made Sarah's hands tremble as she raised her camera. "Take us lower," she said, her voice barely steady. "You sure? Weather service says more storms coming. Lower, Jake, please." As they descended, the water became clearer, and Sarah could see straight through to what lay beneath. Her camera clicked rapidly, documenting what the flood had uncovered after decades of hiding. There, perfectly preserved in the muddy water, were the remains of another house. Not just any house. Sarah recognized it immediately from faded photographs her mother had shown her years ago. It was the original Whitmore homestead, the house where Thomas's grandfather had raised his family in the early 1900s, the house her great-grandmother had worked in as a cook and housekeeper, the house where her great-grandmother had lived until she disappeared without a trace in 1952. Sarah's camera captured frame after frame of the ghostly structure beneath the flood. Windows that had been dark for 70 years now stared up at her through the water like hollow eyes. A front porch, still intact, seemed to be waiting for visitors who would never come. "That's odd," Jake said, maneuvering the helicopter for a better view. "Looks like there's something else down there." Sarah leaned forward, pressing her face against the window. Beyond the submerged house, she could make out regular shapes on what used to be the pasture floor. Rectangular outlines, too uniform to be natural. "Are those ... double quotes," she started, then stopped. She knew exactly what they were, even though she didn't want to believe it. Graves, a small cemetery, hidden for decades under layers of dirt and grass. Now revealed by the relentless floodwater. "We need to go back," Sarah said suddenly, her voice tight with emotion she couldn't quite name. "I need to make some calls." Jake nodded and banked the helicopter away from the ranch. But Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the water below until the Whitmore property disappeared behind them. Her mind raced with questions that had no answers. Mysteries that had shaped her family's history without her even knowing it. Why had her great-grandmother disappeared so suddenly? Why had Thomas Whitmore forbidden anyone from the Mitchell family to set foot on his land? And why, after all these years, did she feel like the flood was trying to tell her something? Back in town, Sarah sat in her small office above the insurance agency, staring at the digital photos on her computer screen. The images of the submerged ranch seemed even more haunting on the monitor, ghostly and surreal, like scenes from a dream she couldn't quite remember. She had been born and raised in Cedar Falls, Texas, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone's business. Or so she had always thought. But the Whitmore Ranch had remained a mystery, a forbidden kingdom just beyond the edge of her world. Growing up, she had asked her mother about it countless times. Why can't we go to the Whitmore place like other families? Why does Mr. Whitmore always cross the street when he sees us in town? What happened to great-grandma Alina? Her mother's answers had always been the same. Some things are better left alone. Sarah, some families have their reasons for staying apart, but now, staring at the photos of what the flood had revealed, Sarah felt the weight of those unspoken secrets pressing down on her like the water that covered the ranch. That she picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "It's Sarah. I need to ask you about great-grandma Alina again." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When her mother, Margaret, finally spoke, her voice was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. "What's brought this up again, honey?" "The flood," Sarah said simply. "I was doing damage assessment over the Whitmore place today. The water, ... It's uncovered things, Mom. Old things." Another pause. Longer this time. Sarah could hear her mother's soft breathing, the sound of a decision being weighed. "Your great-grandmother worked for the Whitmores," Margaret said finally. "You know that part. She was their cook and housekeeper for nearly 20 years. Lived in the little house behind the main one, the house that's underwater now." "Yes." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "She took care of Thomas when he was just a boy. Raised him, really. After his mother died young, she was like family to him." Sarah waited, sensing there was more. But something happened in 1952. Alina came home one night, packed her things, and left town before dawn. Never said goodbye. Never wrote a letter, just vanished like she'd never existed. And Thomas changed after that. Became cold, distant, stopped coming to town except when he absolutely had to. And he made it very clear that no one from our family was welcome on his land, ever. Sarah stared at the photos on her screen, at the small cemetery she had glimpsed beneath the floodwater. "Mum," she said carefully, "did Alina ever come back?" The silence stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been dropped. "No," Margaret whispered finally. "She never came back. But Sarah, ... I always wondered if maybe she never really left." The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it had actually uncovered something that was meant to stay hidden. She drove out to the Whitmore ranch, parking at the main gate that stood open for the first time in her memory. The flood had receded enough that she could walk across the soggy ground, though her boots squelched with every step. The main house loomed ahead of her, its white paint stained with mud and debris. Windows that had always seemed to watch the road now looked blind and empty. But it was the area behind the house that drew her where the floodwater had revealed the old homestead and the cemetery. As she approached, Sarah could see that the water had indeed uncovered graves, 7 of them, marked with simple stone crosses that had been hidden under decades of grass and earth. Most of the inscriptions were too weathered to read, but one marker, newer than the rest, was perfectly clear. Alina Vasquez, Mitchell, beloved cook and friend 1910 to 1952. She found her way home. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sat down hard in the muddy grass, staring at the headstone that answered a 70-year-old question. Her great-grandmother hadn't disappeared. She had died here, on the ranch, and Thomas Whitmore had buried her in secret. But why? "I wondered if you'd come." Sarah spun around to find a woman standing behind her, elderly, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed familiar somehow. "I'm sorry," Sarah stammered, getting to her feet. "I know I'm trespassing. You're Sarah Mitchell," the woman said with a slight smile. "Elena's great-granddaughter. You look just like her. How do you?" "I'm Rose Whitmore, Thomas's daughter." The woman extended a weathered hand. "I've been waiting 30 years for you to finally make it onto this ranch." Sarah shook the offered hand, her mind reeling. Thomas Whitmore had a daughter. Not many people knew. "I moved to Dallas after high school, rarely came back. But when Dad passed last week, I inherited all of this." Rose gestured to the flooded ranch around them, including his secrets. She pulled a manila envelope from her coat pocket and handed it to Sarah. "He left this for you, specifically, with instructions that it should be given to Elena's family when the time was right." I think the flood was his way of saying the time had come. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in careful script on aged paper. "My dear Elena's family. If you are reading this, then the truth has finally been revealed, as I always knew it would be. I have carried this secret for 70 years, and it has been the heaviest burden of my life. Alina Vasquez was more than my family's housekeeper. She was my surrogate mother, my dearest friend, and the woman I loved more than my own life. When I asked her to marry me in 1952, she said yes. But we both knew that a Mexican woman and a white ranch owner could not marry in Texas in those days without causing scandal and danger for us both. We decided to keep our engagement secret until we could move somewhere more accepting. But Alina became ill that winter. Consumption, the doctor said. She died in my arms on a cold February night, and I buried her here, on the land she had grown to love. With a ceremony befitting the wife she would have been. I kept our secret because I thought it would protect her memory and your family's reputation. But in doing so, I robbed you of the chance to mourn her properly. And I robbed myself of the chance to grieve with the people who loved her as much as I did. I made Alina a promise that night that I would take care of the land she loved, and I would make sure her family was always provided for, even if we had to stay apart. The trust fund that has been anonymously paying for your family's children's education was my way of honoring that promise. I hope that someday, when this letter finds its way to you, you can forgive an old man's fear and pride. Alina deserves to be remembered not as a woman who disappeared, but as a woman who found love and acceptance in the most unlikely place. The ranch is yours now, if you want it. Alina always said it would be a good place to raise children and grow things. She was right about everything else. With deepest apologies and respect, Thomas Whitmore. Sarah read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. Rose waited patiently, her own eyes bright with unshed emotion. He loved her, Sarah whispered. With everything he had, Rose confirmed. I grew up hearing stories about Alina, about how she would hum while she cooked, about how she could calm any horse just by speaking to it, about how she made this big, lonely house feel like a home. He never married anyone else, said Alina was his only love. Sarah looked back at the headstone, at the simple words carved in stone. She found her way home. He wrote that himself. Said Alina always told him that home wasn't a place. It was where you found the people who understood you completely. Over the next few weeks, as the floodwater slowly receded, more of the ranch's secrets were revealed. Sarah returned daily, sometimes with Rose, sometimes alone, piecing together the story of a love that had been forced to hide in shadows. They found the little house where Alina had lived, its rooms preserved like a time capsule. Her apron still hung on a hook by the kitchen door. Her Bible, written in Spanish, sat on the nightstand beside a pressed flower yellow rose, Thomas's favorite. In the main house, Sarah discovered a locked room that Rose had never been allowed to enter. Inside they found it was a shrine to Elena's memory. Photographs of her gardening, cooking, laughing with young Thomas. Letters she had written to her family back in Mexico. Even a wedding dress. Carefully preserved in tissue paper, the dress she would have worn if they'd had the chance to marry publicly. He kept everything, Rose said softly, running her fingers over a photograph of Alina teaching a young Thomas to braid a horse's tail. Every memory, every memento. He couldn't let her go. Sarah understood now why Thomas had forbidden her family from the ranch, not out of hatred or prejudice, but out of a grief so profound that he couldn't bear to see Elena's relatives and be reminded of what he'd lost. It wasn't cruelty, it was heartbreak. But she also understood something else as she stood in that room surrounded by evidence of a deep, true love. Alina hadn't disappeared or been forgotten. She had been treasured, protected, mourned properly by someone who understood her worth. The anonymous scholarship fund that had put Sarah through college, that had helped her cousins get educations they never could have afforded, that had been Thomas's way of caring for Elena's family from a distance, honoring the promise he'd made to a dying woman to look after the people she loved. What will you do with the ranch? Rose asked one afternoon as they stood together at Elena's grave. The floodwater had completely receded now, leaving the little cemetery exposed to sunlight for the first time in decades. Sarah considered the question as she placed fresh wildflowers on the headstone. She thought about her small apartment in town, her lonely life processing insurance claims and damage reports. She thought about Elena's dreams of raising children and growing things on this land. I think, she said slowly, I'd like to learn to grow roses. Alina would have liked that. Rose smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. Dad would have liked that too. He always said this place was meant to have children's laughter in it again. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the main house, her house, now teaching her young nephew, Miguel, how to make Elena's recipe for cornbread. The instructions had been found written on a card in Elena's careful handwriting, stained with decades of use. The house felt different now that its secrets had been exposed to light and air. No longer a mausoleum to lost love, it was becoming a home again. Sarah had kept Elena's shrine exactly as Thomas had left it, but she'd opened the doors and windows, let sunshine stream in, filled the rooms with the sounds of family visits and Sunday dinners. Rose had become a frequent visitor, sharing stories about her father and helping Sarah understand the man behind the mystery. They had discovered that Thomas had been quietly donating to local charities for years, supporting Mexican-American families in ways that would have made Alina proud. He was trying to be the man she saw in him, Rose had explained, but he was too afraid and too proud to let anyone see that side of him. The ranch was thriving under Sarah's care. Though she'd made some significant changes, the old cemetery had been restored and expanded into a proper memorial garden where Elena's story could be told honestly. A small plaque explained how love had bridged cultural divides even when the world wasn't ready to accept such unions. Sarah had also started a foundation in Elena's name, offering scholarships to immigrant families and supporting programs that preserved cultural heritage. It felt like the right way to honor both Elena's memory and Thomas's decades of anonymous giving. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the small group of graves beside Elena's. Thomas Whitmore's headstone, simple and elegant, bore the inscription Sarah had chosen. He kept his promise. 1920 to 2025. On quiet evenings, Sarah would walk out to the memorial garden and sit beside the graves, watching the sunset paint the sky the same colors as the roses she was learning to grow. She would tell Elena about her day, about the ranch, about the family that was slowly healing from generations of separation and misunderstanding. Sometimes Rose would join her, and they would share memories, Rose talking about the father she'd never fully understood until after his death, Sarah sharing the stories her mother had finally been willing to tell about Elena's life before the ranch. "Do you think they would be happy?" Rose asked one evening as they watched the last light fade over the pastures. Sarah considered the question, thinking about the letters they'd found between Elena and Thomas, about the careful way he'd preserved every sign of her presence in his life, about the decades of sacrifice he'd made to keep his promise to a woman who'd died too young. "I think," she said finally, "that they found what they were looking for, even if they couldn't have it the way they wanted. Elena found someone who saw her completely and loved her exactly as she was. Thomas found someone who made him want to be better than he thought he could be. And now," Sarah smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't known was possible. "Now the secret doesn't have to be a burden anymore. It can just be a love story." As if in response to her words, a gentle breeze stirred the roses in Elena's garden, carrying their sweet scent across the ranch that had finally become the home it was always meant to be. The flood had taken so much from the surrounding communities, but it had also given something back, the truth that had been waiting 70 years beneath the surface, patient as the land itself, ready to bloom when the time was right. Sarah Mitchell had never been allowed on Thomas Whitmore's ranch, but Elena Vasquez's great-granddaughter had found her way home at last, carrying with her the love that had survived separation, secrecy, and death itself. In the end, that was all that mattered. Love endured, even when it seemed lost. Truth surfaced, even when it was buried deep. And home, as Elena had always known, wasn't a place on a map. It was where you found the people who understood that some stories are worth waiting for, and no matter how long it takes to tell them. The ranch would continue, no longer a place of secrets and sorrow, but a testament to the idea that love, real love, could bridge any divide and heal any wound, given enough time and patience. And in the rose garden that grew more beautiful each season, Elena's spirit lived on, not as a mystery or a tragedy, but as a reminder that some promises are kept across decades, and some love stories are worth every moment of waiting for their true ending.